Good morning again. My name is Tom Pryor. I'm one of the pastors here. Perhaps you came in before the initial introduction at the beginning of the service, but glad you are here. We are in part 2 of a message series called Sticky Situations. The big idea, what we're trying to do here is basically learn how to navigate situations that are complex, circumstances that are often hazardous, particularly when it comes to dealing with relationships, when dealing with other people. And before we get into all that I want to say this morning, I kind of want to paint a broad picture of what we're really aiming for. Not simply just getting on the other side of a situation and being without getting hurt, but rather we're aiming for a word, and this word is peace. Joke's on me. Peace. Now, with the word peace or disturbance, many things can come to mind. I'm sure for each one of us, peace looks a little bit different, right? I think for a lot of people, sometimes the image that is drawn up when you think of peace is like sitting beside, a fireplace, enjoying a nice cup of coffee or something, reading a book, or it's like being at the water, there's waves, there's a light breeze, there's sunshine, there's birds chirping. It's just calm, serenity, peace. For others, like Lou, who talked about this last week, his is like when he opens a jar of peanut butter for the first time and the top is really smooth. He's a simple man. And let me tell you, if you give him that and a jar of jelly and a loaf of bread, his whole day will be amazing. Changes his life. But for others of us, peace is different. For me, I loved when, when it first snows. I know snow sometimes can be controversial. But when it snows and it's beautiful outside and no one has stepped into it, it's really, really it just looks so Bob Ross painted the outside. That for me is peace. I love that. But there's other definitions of peace, right? If you look at a dictionary, the dictionary definition of peace is the absence or the lack of conflict or war, which, let's be real, that's a pretty good definition, right? Nobody enjoys the fact that countries are fighting one another in this world, right? We root for peace. We want peace. We'd rather have people not fighting. I think that's a good thing. Not taking other people's lives is a great idea. But there's a million different ways to define peace. But I want to talk about how maybe our idea of peace is maybe insufficient. It's not great enough. I'll get to it here. So a lot of times we talk about a disturbance, right? We talk about something that bothers us. Maybe it's a person we know. There's this family member that you have that's they just get under your skin, and they don't even have to say anything. It'd just be one look, and you'd be like, okay, there goes the peace. We're gonna butt heads. Or maybe it's somebody at work, or maybe somebody every Saturday morning starts cutting their grass at 6:30 a.m. Tony, he knows who he is. And that is the disturbance, right? And it starts to mess up how we feel, and the rest of our day or week can be off because of the disturbance. And sometimes we define peace as the removal of that thing. The absence of the disturbance is peace, right? The absence of fighting, the absence of arguing, the absence of stress or responsibility or problematic encounters with people. The absence of things, the removal, the lack of those things, we might call peace. But I think that's more like peace light. I think it's peace adjacent. It's close to peace, but it's not true peace. And I think there's a better idea. And we get it from this word that was used in ancient Hebrew. It was the word shalom. It's still used today. It's often used as a greeting. They'll say shalom. Jewish people will say shalom to one another. But the idea here is not simply not fighting. It's not arguing. It's more than that. It's better than that. It means to be better together, that there's harmony, that there's togetherness. There's the idea of that somehow the whole is much greater than the sum of its individual parts. And really, I think we all want this. I think this is what we're chasing for, not simply not fighting with one another, not simply okay, everybody's in their corner doing their own thing, and it's quiet and cool. Sometimes we'll settle for that, right? Any parent in here knows that there's times where you're just give me quiet. I hope they're asleep. I want them to be alive, but if they would just be quiet for 10 minutes, that'd be great. But really, I think we're going for this idea of shalom, of togetherness, of completeness, of working alongside one another for something better. How much better would it be than simply like, okay, everybody in the house is quiet, doing their own thing, but rather like they're hanging out together and they want to be with one another, and it's beautiful and joyful. That's an idea of peace. For me, as a musician, let's go back. For me, as a musician, disturbance is like going to Guitar Center. Has anyone ever been to Guitar Center before? It can be an awesome place, or it can be like hell, because you have like 15 different guitar players all cranking through very loud amps. No one's playing the same song. No one's in tune with one another, and you can hear the drums and the bass guitars going off in the distance, and then there's overhead music that's playing all at the same time. It sounds insane. It is disturbing to me. If you ever wanted to get like the truth from me, bring me to Guitar Center and make me not leave for an hour, and I'll be like, I'll tell you anything you want. Get me out of here. And for sure, the absence of all of that ruckus and noise and cacophony and all that stuff would be nice, right? Silence, quiet. But isn't there something better than all of that? And you've experienced this before, right? Hopefully, maybe even today. Like when a band or a chorus group or a symphony plays the same piece of music at the same time and they're working together, it is so much better than simply the removal of noises. Have you ever been on a sports team and your team is just like, they're playing, not just at the peak of their ability, but like the communication is so clear. You just make these plays, whether it be soccer or hockey or basketball, where you're like, it feels like we are one mind. We're just moving in the same direction together and it's going off better than it would be if we were doing our own thing. This is what we want. We want this idea of shalom, of better together, of peace. You want that in your families. You want that in your work. And I think we all want this, but also I believe that God wants this for us. That, yes, he would love for us to not fight, sure. But I think there's a version of peace that is so much better, and that's what he wants for us. Fortunately, we have a guy named Paul. He was one of the apostles that came after the death and resurrection of Jesus, who, for a guy who was growing up at that time, he was like, he referred to himself as like the most Jewish person, like the Jew of Jews. Like he got everything right with regards to his education, keeping the law, and doing all of these things to the point where he almost became self-righteous. And eventually he became a follower of Jesus, and it radically changed his life. Now, in this time, this is the first century, 2,000 years ago, the church was not like a big organization. It was actually just a small groups of people here and there who were following this guy Jesus, who was trying to live their lives to honor the teachings of Jesus. And Paul felt the responsibility now as a follower of Jesus himself to like shepherd these people, like tell them what's really going on. So he would write letters to different places and be like, hey, I know this is new for all of us, but there's now a way of doing life that is unique and different, and it leads to better. It leads to health. It leads to shalom. It leads to peace. And I want to tell you all about it. And he writes them these things, and they read it, and they pass it around from house to house, and they're like, oh, this is pretty interesting. Let's try to do this. And so in one of his letters to the church in Ephesus, which we're going to be looking at, he writes, basically, he sets the scene like there was an old version of you before Jesus, and now because of Jesus, there's a new version of you. So let's not live the old way. Let's not live like everyone else has been living, because you're different now. We're not better than them, like we're better people than them, but things are different because of Jesus. So let's live this new way. And he writes this in the 4th chapter of this letter, and he writes, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit, right? We all belong to this one spiritual being, God. So let's keep the unity through the bond of peace. He's like, that's what we're aiming for. Let's keep, not just like keep the peace where, we just don't say anything. We don't want to, disturb the water. We don't want to do anything like this. It's more than that. Let's actually have a bond of peace with one another. But what's interesting is this phrase here, make every effort. Meaning, this is not automatic, right? This doesn't just happen naturally. Whether you're inside the church or you're outside the church, right? Whether you've been brought up with all of the teachings, when you know the Bible inside and out and you pray every day, or not, peace doesn't come naturally. It requires work, and Paul's pointing to that. And he then goes on to say, like, don't forget that we belong to one body, meaning the whole of the church, all of the different members of the church. Yes, we exist as individuals. Yes, we exist within communities, but we are part of one thing. Don't forget that there's one God above all and in all. Don't forget that we were brought into one faith. And he keeps using this word, one, over and over, because he's pointing to oneness. He's like, that's what we're aiming for. We want to have oneness, unity, peace, shalom. We want to be better together. But again, we have to make every effort. Can we have that slide? We have to make every effort. We have something to do here. We have a responsibility here to keep, and preserve the peace. Now, last week, Lou talked about what we do basically when the peace is busted up. When somebody has crossed a line, when somebody has done something wrong, what do we actually do to make it better? And what we learned was that conflict is not necessarily the absence of peace, but healthy, true, usable conflict brings us back, restores us to that person, right? That's what conflict is for. It means something's wrong, we got to deal with it. This week, when it comes to making every effort, what we're trying to do here is maintain, preserve peace, and prevent the disruption of our shalom, our being together. So Paul does give us the how, and he starts to write to these people in the church of Ephesus, and he says, like, don't forget, right? There was a way of doing things, right? The old you, take off the old you, put it away, throw it out. You are no longer those people because you are now Christians. You're Jesus followers. So put on the new you and live this way. And he says to them things like, throw away, put away all falsehood. Anytime you felt like you were not being honest with somebody, get rid of that. We're not doing that anymore. And instead, be truthful to one another. Because we belong to one body. We're all part of the same team. And if you're here and you're like, okay, but I'm not a Christian, right? I'm not a Jesus follower. Are you even talking to me? Well, I want to say, one, glad you're here. But I think that you should give this a shot. I think you should try this because I think it will genuinely lead you to a better place with your relationships. You'll be more likely to aim for peace with one another than without. And perhaps you might start to see that there's something of substance here to this Jesus guy. So after he says, right, we're all part of one body, do away with the old way of doing things, speak truthfully to one another, he says the following. He says, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. He's like, one of the primary ways you can maintain genuine peace with one another, one of the best ways that you can preserve your healthy relationships, one of the best ways not to break the bond of peace is with our words. It's our words. Because our words play a powerful part in our peace. And you know this. This isn't necessarily revolutionary, but it's a very good reminder. Because really, like, if things are going good, all it takes is one ill-timed or ill-worded or demeaning text message. And now things aren't right. All it takes is for one person to say something, and it feels like now you're on the defensive and you got to prove yourself or make things right with this person because they're out of line. All it takes is one person stepping outside of the peace to disrupt it. Our words play an enormous part in keeping the peace. And in that verse, basically what it's saying is that our words build up or they tear down. They tear apart. Our words can be used for good, right? We know this, right? Encouragement. Feels awesome. This morning, I was tired and I was feeling like a little out of sorts, and somebody wrote me a note and said, hey, you're going to do great today. I was like, thank you. I hope it works. But it felt good to read, right? Encouragement. There are words of affirmation, and there are words of correction that, done in love, lead to a better outcome, right? There is a way to use our words for good, for building up. But as we all know, our words, what we say, the sentences we string together, how we say them, the timing, the tone of voice, those things can be incredibly destructive. And Jesus had this brother. His name was James. And he wrote a letter to a group of Christians. And in part of this letter, his letter is really, really beautiful. I would recommend. It's in the New Testament. It's very, very practical. If you're like, how do I get handles on faith? James is a great book to read. But he gives us this like long passage about the power of the tongue, which is a synonym for our words. And he's like, the tongue is an amazing thing. Despite its small size, it has such an enormous effect on a person, on how they live, on where their body goes, on what their future is like. It's not unlike a bit that we put into a horse's mouth. Though the horse might be, 1,000 pounds and humongous compared to a person, we can steer a horse with a small rod placed in the mouth of a horse. That's what the tongue is like. He also goes on to say the tongue is like the rudder of a ship. Ships are huge, but the rudder is relatively small in comparison. But with it, you can steer a boat and help it navigate and send it to where it needs to go. And then he goes on and adds another metaphor, and he says the tongue itself is a fire, which fire can be very good, right? Warmth, light, heat, cooking, food. But it's like, a small spark can set a forest on fire. That's what the tongue is. The tongue has so much potential. Our words build up or tear apart our togetherness, our peace. So then what do we do? What do we do, Paul? How do we manage this? Let's go back to that verse. This is what he says. He says, do not let. He starts with do not let. The idea there is that words are going to bubble up. When you're confronted with a certain situation, when you're with a certain person, sometimes words will just come out of nowhere. It doesn't even feel like you said them. Something inside you said it and it came out. He's like, you can't let that happen. You need to be paying attention to this. Sometimes it feels like you're not in control. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. This unwholesome word here is a word for like decay, like rotting. Not like sometimes people say like, oh, I'm in a rotten mood or something because they're just in a bad mood. This is not that. This is more like taking a gross, moldy apple and putting it with fresh apples and watching those fresh apples deteriorate very quickly. That's what he's saying. It's unwholesome. It's decaying. It leads to death. It's not for health. Don't let those things come out of your mouths. Let no unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. What he's saying is, you can't be a person who uses unguarded talk. If you belong to this Jesus guy, if you're following after him, if you want to be a person of peace, of togetherness in your families, in your households, in your work, in your neighborhoods, in your communities, we have to be careful about our unguarded talk. There are very obvious things here like slander. That's just like straight up lying about a person to ruin their reputation, right? To get them in trouble. And things like gossip, which simply put, usually gossip is just talking about a person when they're not there, and sometimes that cannot be avoided. But it's how we talk about the person. Are we talking about them honestly? We're talking about them truthfully, which reminds me. Last week, Lou said that I stubbed my toe, and I said a dirty word. That is not true. I said several, which makes him a liar. So we should pray for him. So corny. But gossip, this stuff destroys the peace. Which is what's so sad about that. Like, we do this on our own. We don't need help. But there are organizations that literally exist to promote gossip. Have you ever heard of TMZ? Yeah, like they make money off of gossip. That's a crazy job. Anyway, this is unfortunate. We don't want to be people that participate in gossip, right? And then there's sarcasm, which, okay, let's be real. If you're like in New York, sarcasm is like how we talk to one another. And if you don't get it, it's because That was sarcasm, right? But there are times where sarcasm is very funny, right? And it's often harmless. But there are times where sarcasm, especially when it comes to children, can be like they don't get it and then they have to get it, and it really insults like their well-being and their intelligence. And what's fascinating with the word sarcasm is that it comes from two Greek words, sarx and chasm. We don't have a word for sarx, like easy translation, it's flesh. We have a word for chasm, it's chasm. And basically what that means is tearing of flesh. That's the word picture of sarcasm. It's not like an innocuous whatever, like it's a lighthearted comment. Sometimes sarcasm literally tears at the heart of a person. And what Paul's saying, don't have unguarded talk. For some of us, this is really hard. Because some of us try to live sometimes or saying that, I'm sorry, I just have no filter. And what Paul's saying is like, you can't live that way. That's not an excuse. You're not the old way anymore. That old version of you, it's gone, done away with. Don't adopt the old ways as if they're still a part of you. Live in the new way. This whole unguarded talk thing has to go away. Some of you might remember or have seen posters that were from like World War II. It had a certain phrase on them, and it said this. It said, "Loose lips sink ships." Has anyone seen those posters before or heard that phrase before? This applies here. Now, maybe you don't have a ship, but what this was talking about was like when people who were in the military would talk about military plans or how many soldiers were there, how much ammunition or whatever it might be, and you're just talking casually about these things, you might be letting somebody else in on that info that doesn't need to hear it. It might be a spy. You might be jeopardizing something super important. So like loose lips, sink ships. Don't just let your mouth go. And I think while most of us probably aren't spies, I think this still applies. That rhymed, and that was not on purpose. So be on guard. Paul is saying you must be on guard. If you want to maintain, can we have that slide? If we want to maintain our peace, if we want to aim to be people of togetherness, if we want to have not just the absence of conflict, not just the absence of fighting, like we're just fine, everyone's doing their own thing, but if we want to have true, meaningful, deep relationships, we must be on guard. What does this mean, Paul? What does it mean to be on guard? Simply put, before you let the words out, we're going to jump ahead a couple slides. Before we let our words out, we must ask ourselves the following thing. Keep going. I believe in you. We must ask ourselves, why? What is the reason behind feeling like we need to say what we're about to say? What's there? Why do you feel compelled to say what you're about to say? Is it for their good? Are you aiming to build up? Are you aiming to increase the shalom, the togetherness, the peace, the working better together? Or are you angry? Are you trying to put them in their place? Are you trying to diminish them as a person, trying to crush their self-worth? This happens. You'll have the opportunity sometimes to do this. I did once, and I totally blew it. Easter Sunday, 2023. My parents were in town. They live in North Carolina. They were in town, and we had dinner after the whole Easter morning here. And I'm standing at the sink. I'm like washing a dish. My parents are at the table, and we're just talking. I don't remember the topic necessarily. And they said something, and I responded with sarcasm. And it was like, I was trying to be funny, a little digging. It was a small little dig. And what's really sad on my part is that my parents were like, huh? Like they totally didn't understand anything I was saying. It was like God was like, here's your opportunity to be on guard. They didn't get it the first time. Shut your mouth. ask yourself, why are you about to say this? And what I was like, nope. And I was like, I said it again, but with more snark. And we had a wonderful time. No, it blew things up and it turned into a bad argument that was entirely my fault. Entirely my fault. Why? Because I wasn't on guard. I didn't stop to ask myself, why am I saying this? And if I were to think about that now and be honest with you, it's because I was probably harboring some amount of unforgiveness. And I was like being mean. I was being a jerk. I wasn't aiming for their good. I wasn't being like, you know what? I'm sure what I'm about to say is going to make everything even better. Not the case at all. I totally ruined. That evening was ruined because of like 6 words that I said. And I didn't keep a tight rein on my mouth. So this is what we must do. If you're going to be the people of peace that Paul's talking about, if you're going to be the type of person when you're dealing with your coworkers, your boss, the people that report to you, and you want to increase the good, increase the togetherness, we must do this. And I bet if we started to do this, whether it's at work, with family, with our neighborhood, with our communities, we started to do all I'm saying is stop and ask why. If we just did that one thing, I bet 90% of the conversations that could be problematic wouldn't be. Because we would know enough, if we were honest with ourselves, we would know what we're trying to do. Are we trying to just be mean? Are we just trying to be cruel? Are we actually trying to help? Am I being honest in this situation? Am I being kind here? Because, why is this so important? Because our words, they play an enormous, powerful part in the peace, in the shalom. And it's tricky. And this is not easy to do. That's why Paul was like, make every effort. You can't be passive. You have to be proactive and reactive to your own words. And he knew this was going to be tough for us. And what's so cool is that Jesus knew this would be tough for us. So much so that he actually prayed for our peace. There it is. He prayed for our peace. He prayed that we would be better together. In the time leading up to, not directly before, but leading up to when he was going to be arrested and crucified, he sat down with his disciples, his closest followers, and he prayed for them. And he said, God, I pray that these guys would be one as you and I are one. Like the closeness that I feel to you, God the Father, which I know this is a big theological idea, but just roll with it. Like he's like, the connection that I have with you, the blessing in my life that it is to be with you, I want that for my followers. I want the people that I've been with for 3 years, I want them to experience the same kind of love and good and better togetherness that I have experienced with you. And then he expands the prayer and says, but my prayer is not for them alone. My prayer is for any of them who hear their message and believe, which is so cool. He's talking about us 2,000 years later. He's like, I want them to experience that same thing. I pray that they would be one as we are one. Why? Here's what it says. It says, I pray that they may be brought to complete unity, that they'd have shalom, they'd have togetherness, they'd experience that level of good. Why? Because then the world will know that you have sent me, that our peace speaks to a watching world. They'll know that you have sent me and have loved them, the world, as you have loved me. That's amazing. That we can be agents, we can be part of this, we can help make this happen. Imagine, if you would, what the reputation of the church would be like if just all the Christians, ignoring everyone else, but just all the people who were like, yeah, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, I believe in this guy, if those people started to guard their words, start to ask why, in every conversation, in every confrontation, in every sticky situation, they asked, why am I about to say what I'm about to say? And rather than just go the easy route, but like put a guard on and aimed for peace, what would that do? What would that do for the church? What would that do for their closest relationships? What would that do for their families? What would the watching world, and I don't mean just like the globe, the world, but like what would people who are skeptical, who have only seen division and conflict and judgment from the church, start to see if we were people of peace? How might it change their perception? And maybe they would take steps towards it. Maybe you're one of those people, you're like, I've been a part of churches. I don't necessarily believe what they believe, but when I go there, I don't see people who are living better lives. I don't see people who are like kind to one another. Well, if that's the case, sorry, we don't always get it right, but this is what we're supposed to be doing. This is what we're aiming for, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but it's better. It's better to work alongside than to just simply be apart. That it's better to have harmony and to be pulling in the same direction than every single person, not fighting, but like they're getting along. That our families wouldn't be like, well, everybody's in their own room doing their own thing, reading their own books, playing their own video games, watching their own TV, doing their own things. But rather we're a family that like wants to be together. And we're in each other's corners. And we're trying to make things even better than they've been. That's what Paul is after. That's what Jesus even prayed for you and I. But it takes work. We have to make every effort. So will you be bold? Bold enough not to go talk to someone else. Be like, I think this message was for you. But bold enough to look in the mirror and be like, it starts with me. It starts with you. But we can do this because Jesus prayed for it.